Well, it's really nice to see a lot of new faces and familiar faces. On behalf of the Vermont School Boards Association Board, it is my sincere privilege and pleasure to welcome you to our regional meetings. It is an honor to be here with you today. I hope that you all had a chance to connect with your region. I will also like to congratulate and welcome our newly elected VSBA board members. I deeply admire the work that you all do. I know we have board members and superintendents here with us today. I admire the work that you're doing for your districts, as each of us have a profound impact on the success of our students. Our shared commitment to all our students and to public education transcends any differences that we may have, offering us a common ground of which to work together. By holding public education as a fundamental human right, we stand for the principles of equity, justice, and freedom, values that are essential for a thriving democracy. The Vermont School Boards Association is here for you, and I'm excited about the positive change, the positive impact that we can have and create together for the future of all our students in Vermont. We look forward to seeing you at our fall conference. And now I would like to welcome Agency of Education Interim Secretary Zoe Sanders. It's nice to have you with us.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Zoe Saunders, the Interim Secretary of Education. Thank you, Flor, for the introduction and the invitation to join you at your regional meeting this evening. I was asked to share some information around our Listen and Learn tour and also to provide some updates around how you can get involved and share your input and insights from the perspective of a school board member. I first want to thank the Vermont School Boards Association for staying very closely coordinated with the Agency of Education over the past several months. We've been meeting at a regular cadence about once a month to provide input around how we can work productively together and also to gain specific feedback as we roll out our Listen and Learn tour and really develop our strategic plan as an agency. Before sharing some details around the Listen and Learn tour, I just wanted to highlight some of the key components of our strategic plan as it is under development. We have heard feedback from the School Boards Association and other stakeholders that we have really taken to heart and are informing a lot of our operational improvements as an agency. So there's three key areas that we are working at having a concerted effort to make measurable improvements, and that is around improving data accessibility and reporting, improving our communication and consistent messaging, and three, having better internal alignment and coordination in order to really have that coherent approach and engagement with our partners. We've also identified several content areas that we're focusing on in order to really promote improved outcomes across the state. And that's focused on improving literacy and math outcomes, expanding college and career readiness, and supporting the overall mental health needs of our students. Our Listen and Learn tour is designed to help validate that these priorities are in fact the most urgent and pressing for our communities across the state. The Listen and Learn tour is designed to fully engage the entire agency in planning with our partners and stakeholders, our schools and students in the field to align our work and initiatives to meet the educational needs and priorities of the state of Vermont. As we go through this work, we'll also be able to identify really important input and insights that can also inform the planning that's underway on the Commission on the Future of Public Education. I want to share a little bit about the phased approach for the Listen and Learn so you can see what to expect as we begin to engage in this work. The month of August has been focused first on data reporting. I hope you've seen, we did publish last week a state profile report. This is the first in a series of education reports that are intended to help us ground our conversations and planning in data, evidence, and facts. We will be providing some subsequent reports that are looking at education trends at the regional level and also doing a deeper dive also into financials. The intent of this report is to really begin to set the table around the current state of education. And we've put together a number of different indicators looking at enrollment and academic performance along with financials to give a comprehensive view. We recognize that this first report is not a final report. It really is designed to generate more questions and conversation that will really help us to make key decisions as an agency of how we can support the state of Vermont in really elevating our public education outcomes and opportunities. As we move forward, our next phase of this work will be engaging with education leaders to look more regionally at this data and identify strengths and opportunities, and overall to create a profile of education across our state. Those regional convenings will be held between mid-September and mid-October, and we'll be inviting school board representatives from school boards to participate in that as well. Those convenings will be structured to share some broad information that will be important for all of our education leaders that will be in attendance. Those leadership roles will include superintendents, principals, curriculum directors, business managers, school board members, teacher representatives, and others. And then we'll have breakout sessions by subgroup to really dive into topics that are going to be most relevant for the education leaders present. After that, in the mid-October to November timeframe, we'll be having broader public convenings. We'll be inviting general members of the public to engage in these conversations and to really validate what we're identifying as priorities and really looking at how we can capitalize on the strengths of communities and exploring potentially new strategies to improve our educational system. These convenings are really organized around two key principles. One is to make sure that we're promoting informed input. So at these sessions, we'll certainly bring in information, data, and facts, and information that's relevant to that specific region. And the second piece is to facilitate two-way conversation and really having engaging dialogue that's capturing those educational priorities so that we're really having a robust and full conversation. So in terms of your input, it's really important that we continue to engage with our school board members across the state in providing your localized input and insights on the ground. There will be several ways for you to participate. We will be providing a survey, and we will also invite you to the regional convenings and ask that you identify a representative from your school board to participate in those sessions. I also would welcome and really appreciate your involvement in the broader public forums that will involve more members of the community to engage in these conversations around topics that are most important to our education system, and helping us to strengthen and make improvements that are going to be in the best interest of our students. So I hope and welcome that you stay involved with us in this process, and would be open if anyone has any questions. I could take a couple before the next segment of your agenda if there's time.
Thank you very much, Interim Secretary Saunders. And I do think we have a little bit of time if anyone has a question. I'm not seeing any hands.
I'll have a question. I
Okay.
couldn't get to my raise hand thing but fast enough before I thought you might move on. I unmuted.
Go ahead, Angela.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Interim Secretary Saunders. I was wondering about the data that was recently provided on school district spending, and if there is any, if you think that that data will be updated to reflect inflation or account for inflation, because that was not accounted for in the data that was released last week, I believe.
I think one of the things we've committed to is having a deeper dive around education spending. That's had a lot of conversation around that in the recent days, and that will be included in subsequent reporting and beginning to look more, get more refined in that. There's even some interest in looking at that at kind of an object code level to really understand where we are spending. And we are looking to understand those patterns across the state. There's also been an interest in being able to capture the cost of providing mental health care support to our students. And so that's some of the work that we'll be doing in partnership with our education leaders in the regional convening. So there's some data we have visibility to now. There's additional data we can bring forward to bring, a more nuanced view of spending. And then there's some information that we're going to need to work with the field to collect and capture.
Thank you. I think it's important, just given the very real inflationary pressures that districts have faced, and to avoid painting an inaccurate picture of like out of control spending, independent from the full context.
Understood. So I think maybe I should answer that differently, is being able to capture the drivers, right? Where we're seeing increase in spending and what those pressures are. Absolutely, I think it's important to capture that.
Mike Kane,
Question.
go ahead.
Yeah, your website indicates that there will be a survey available in August. Has that survey already gone out, or is that yet to come?
That is yet to come. We actually received some really constructive feedback from the VSBA and other stakeholders to make some refinements to that survey to ensure that there's clarity around the questions. So we're capturing data that is really actionable and supportive of our work. So it's an example of us being very responsive to feedback from the field and spending a little bit more time making sure that we're crafting those questions in a way that will be well understood. But that will be coming shortly, and we really value and appreciate the feedback that we received from many of your members and other stakeholders as well.
Thank you. We'll move to Alice Farrell and then Martine Gulick and then Leon Johnson, and then we'll have to move on to the rest of our program.
Great.
Go ahead, Alice.
Great. Thank you. I'm just wondering if you have any information about any legislation that might be coming in the next session that would affect schools or education in general in the state. Anything that we should be watching for?
So as many on the call are likely aware, there's a number of working groups that have been established that are charged to provide recommendations to the General Assembly regarding a number of education matters. So there's a pre-K committee that is scheduled to make some recommendations for this session. There's also a school construction aid working group that will be making recommendations on how to address the facility needs of our schools. And then the Commission on the Future of Public Education has been charged with proposing short-term cost containment strategies. So from the Agency of Education's perspective, we have been coordinated with all of this work and trying to really create alignment. So there's a comprehensive set of considerations that we're looking at to take the full needs into account of our public education system.
Thank you. We'll move to Martine Gulick. I'm not sure.
Martine, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Thank you, Secretary Saunders. Thank you, Sue, for calling on me. I had a question that I asked of Lindsay, and I haven't heard back from her yet, but as I was looking at the report that was sent out, at the very beginning of the report, it says that the listening tour is designed to foster a data-driven dialogue about the future of public education and align the agency's strategic plan to the state's educational priorities. And I was wondering, you don't have to do it now necessarily, but I was wondering if at some point you could please share with us what the agency's strategic plan is, and also what the state's educational priorities are. I just wasn't clear as to what those two things are, and if they exist, where are they? And just would love some more information on those.
Yeah, so we are in the process of developing the agency strategic plan, and we're leveraging the Listen and Learn tour to validate our areas of focus. So I've identified kind of in the beginning of the meeting, there's kind of two components of that. One are operational improvements within the agency, and then there's looking at work to actually elevate statewide outcomes. So as we look at operational improvements, we're really working diligently to improve our data reporting and accessibility to ensure that we're driving those conversations in a way that are grounded in our results. So that's really beginning to accelerate a lot of the reporting so that we're able to use that data in real time. That's a considerable focus for us right now. The second operational improvement is really improving our communication and ensuring there's consistent messaging. That also involves providing clear guidance around your legislative priorities and other initiatives that are being implemented across the state so that the agency can be a very effective partner in providing that guidance and support. And then the third area is really promoting that inner agency coordination to make sure that we're streamlining our work in support of the needs of the field. So operationally, those are some of our key priority improvements. In terms of driving outcomes, we are working and launching several initiatives to promote literacy and improve math outcomes, along with expanding college and career readiness access and supporting the overall mental health needs of our students. This work has these priorities have emerged through our initial analysis and also engagement with the field. And this robust process of a listen and learn will help us to really validate that and identify if there are other priorities that need to be addressed, not only to meet the current needs of the moment in Vermont, but to prepare ourselves to support the future vision, which is why there is that alignment to the work that is happening on the commission and understanding how we can be supportive of that.
Go ahead, Leon Johnson.
Well, thank you, Sue, and thank you, Interim Secretary Sanders. Leon Johnson here, and my question has to be centered around tech education in Vermont. We have a system that allow us to send students from the regular schools to tech education, but there's a problem with the money that follows them and take care and support them. And host schools are really reluctant, even though there's documentation that says all of the students have the right to tech education, but there's no real incentive to release a lot of the students because there's a money issue dealing with the host school versus the technical educational school. We have a big need in this state for technical educated students to be here because we don't have a lot of big industries, and a lot of kids need to have all these special trainings, but they're not really getting them like they should because of what the perception about money following the students from the whole school and investment in their education. You care. I attended the first opening meeting, but I didn't see a lot about tech education, and I hadn't been able to get back in to see a follow-up on some other things from the group that was going out. And so this just gave me an opportunity to bring this up. And if you don't have comments really for it now, maybe you can take this down and have someone follow up later. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. From the agency perspective, we are very focused on expanding college and career readiness. And part of that is looking at career and technical education. So you've noted some broader questions around the education finance reform. And I think it's really imperative that we're taking that holistic look and looking at our education finance system in terms of the investment we're making in pre-K, the investments in K-12, and also how we're funding high school and other programs that are supporting those pathways to career. So we do have a consultant that we've been working with at the Agency of Education that will be providing recommendations around specific structural and funding reform to be supportive of fully helping students pursue those range of opportunities.
Thank you.
Thanks for all of those questions, and thank you for sticking around to answer questions, Interim Secretary Saunders. We really appreciate you attending this portion of our meeting to provide the information about ways that school board members can participate in the Listen and Learn tour. And you're certainly welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting. We know you have a busy schedule, so we'll understand if you need to sign off, but you are welcome to stay.
Well, thank you again for inviting me and appreciate being involved. I will allow Courtney O'Brien and Jill Briggs Campbell to take it on for the next agenda item. So thank you.
Thanks. So we will move on to our next agenda item. Before we do that, for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Sue Siglowski. I'm the Executive Director for the VSBA, and I work with an amazing team of 4 other VSBA staff members who work to provide you with resources to support your work as school board members. And I want to thank the VSBA staff for their planning and organizational work to prepare for this evening's event for the members. That's Sandra Cameron, Debbie Singeiser, Carrie Lamb, and David Englander. I would also like to thank the VSBA board members who just ran the business meetings and those who ran for election to the board. We all know it takes a lot of time to serve on a school board, and the VSBA board members take it to the next level by devoting their time on behalf of school boards statewide. So thank you all very much. Now we're going to turn to the main focus of tonight's meeting, which is the governance standards for school boards, which go into effect on July 1, 2025. It is important for school board members to understand the standards well in advance of that effective date, and that is what tonight is all about. First, we're going to hear from Courtney O'Brien and Jill Briggs Campbell from the Agency of Education. Courtney is the AOE Operations Manager, and Jill Briggs Campbell is the AOE Director of Operations. And they're going to talk about the background of the governance standards. And then we'll have an introduction to the standards from 3 current school board members who were involved in the task force that developed and reviewed the standards. And after that, we're going to turn back to Courtney and Jill for information about the rollout of the governance standards. And we do have time reserved at the end for questions. So with that, let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce Courtney O'Brien and Jill Briggs Campbell from the Agency of Education to begin the governance standards presentation, and would ask that Debbie please share slides on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. While Debbie is Debbie, I was going to say, while you're queuing this up, we'll just say hello quickly. Hi, folks. My name is Courtney O'Brien. As Sue mentioned, I am an AOE Operations Manager. I serve the still relatively new operations team here at the AOE. I am joined today by my Operations Director, Jill Briggs Campbell. I'll let Jill say hello here if she'd like.
Yeah. Good evening, folks. It's mainly going to be Courtney that you'll be hearing from, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for this time on I'm sure a busy evening for everyone. I got puppy and sun bombed just a minute and had to go off camera, so we're all juggling things. But really appreciate you giving some time to this really, really important initiative. This is very much tied up in all of the larger ed systems work that we are doing. And we've been really, really pleased to partner with many of you, both the members of the board and then also the VSBA throughout this process. It's been a really deeply collaborative process, and we're eager to field your questions and get your feedback. So thank you so much. And I will let Courtney run the show.
Thank you, Jill. And I will echo Jill's appreciation. We are so excited about this work. It has certainly been a hefty lift for everyone involved. And as we inch quickly closer to implementation, we are realizing just how impactful this project really can be and will be once we are able to implement. And I again echo the thank you for allowing us a few minutes of your time to go over the project. For future reference, should you need it, I've included both Jill and my contact information here. You are welcome to email or contact us at any point in time should you have questions about district quality standards or any of the information we'll talk about today. Next slide, please, Debbie. Thank you. So I will start with a basic overview. Some of you may have attended a webinar earlier this summer about district quality standards, and I will let you know a few of these slides will be duplicative, but we'd like to shift the focus today into the governance standards. However, in order to do that, it is important for us to understand where the district quality standards came from, their origin, and what we do truly expect once they are implemented. So DQS was implemented and was formally adopted and prepared for implementation in July of 2023. It now exists as Rule Series 100 under the Agency of Education Administrative Rules. This is in fact the first and currently only AOE rule. Historically, education rules in Vermont have been managed and implemented via the State Board of Education. However, in this case, Act 127 of 2023 directed the agency specifically to engage in rulemaking around district level quality standards. Folks may recall Act 127 as also being a change in pupil weight piece of legislation that was then adjusted again last session. However, a portion of this rule did include the provision and direction of district quality standards creation. The specifics of this direction required AOE to engage in rulemaking around business, facilities, and governance quality standards. So these were new standards really in two different ways. Number one, this is the first existence of a district level quality standards accountability process. We do measure district quality in other ways, but this was the first appearance of this very structured district quality standards approach. And also these new domains, business, facilities, and governance, again, exist in part in other education quality review and accountability processes, but these were very direct buckets of work related to the more operations and logistics-based work of a district. Quick note, the DQS standards, district quality standards, are applicable to public supervisory unions and supervisory districts only. They are not applicable to independent schools and will become effective on July 1st of 2025. Next slide, please, Debbie. A very critical component to DQS is the rationale, or in other words, why are we doing this and what do we expect to occur in having implemented this new level of accountability? First and foremost, the state and therefore the Agency of Education are responsible for providing equitable access to high quality education to Vermont learners. This is an important phrase. It does appear in many other places, including and not limited to the Vermont Constitution, Vermont statutes, and the AOE's mission and purpose. But it is also at its core something that makes Vermont really special and unique about our delivery of education. We are collectively focused on providing equitable access to high quality education for all students. In order to do that, assurances are needed at multiple levels within our system to support the successful delegation of this authority. So there are certain things that the state provides, there are regulations at a state level, there are things that happen in a classroom that provide that direct accountability between educator and student. And then a leverage point that we're accessing here through DQS is that district level point in our system where we're really talking about systems within the larger setting of Vermont education systems. And lastly, one of the observations leading up to the creation of DQS was that significant process variability, and I'll say significant and sustained process variability in and among our system was exacerbated by, of course, the pandemic, several years following the pandemic, and I think even leading up to that, labor shortages and increased staff turnover, and economic impacts and differences between and among school districts. So again, thinking about how education is funded in Vermont, you may even end up with school districts within an SU that have different economic environments impacting their budgetary decisions. And so all of this really is leading to an environment where districts may not have had a focus on consistency in how they were delivering again, really focusing on operational and logistics-based services. Next slide, please. What do we expect? This is perhaps the most important piece of our presentation. Why are we doing this and what are we looking forward to? Ultimately, with this new rule, we do expect stronger and more consistent district level core processes that can address persistent quality concerns, reduce equity gaps, and mitigate the impact of staff turnover. So again, we're thinking about at a district level, are we consistent, are we equitable, and are we sustainable? I'd like to invite folks to think about the hypothetical, but perhaps not so, example of district leaders or really key district players that may have belonged or participated in district work for decades, and they win the lottery and walk through the doors and we never see them again. And there's suddenly a scramble for how to continue the good work that those districts are doing. We're really hopeful that in providing these very precise and specific levels of measures of quality in these very key and critical components of district operations, we can be more consistent and create a space where districts have a roadmap of sorts into how to create sustainable systems for themselves. Secondly, we do expect that DQS will provide the agency with an increased ability to deliver relevant technical support. So in the current environment, we are quite reactive and we respond in a way that is very directly responsive to what's on fire, what's the emergency of the time. What we don't have is a mechanism to proactively review, address, and potentially analyze where districts need additional supports. So right now, in some cases, it does feel a little bit like there's a bunch of things on fire and our teams are reaching up and grabbing the first thing. What we'd like to create is a system where we can understand ahead of time where systems are weak, where districts need support, and start to deploy that response sooner rather than later, and certainly far in advance of a system really reaching that critical or crisis point. Next slide, please. Thank you. Before I turn it over to our colleagues, our school board member colleagues, to talk about the governance standards, I'll provide just a very brief overview on the larger part of the rule. So again, as a reminder, DQS, when we talk about DQS, district quality standards, we are specifically talking about new district level standards in business operations. Facilities was broken out into two domains, facilities management and facilities safety, and governance. These standards were developed in very close partnership and very consistent partnership with experts in the field. I'm happy to share with folks, I came to the agency in fall of 2022, and one of the first tasks that I was assigned to was to move forward with the collaborative work that ultimately became district quality standards. I am so thankful and appreciative for the participation that we've had from many people from the VSBA, from your Board of Trustees, from the Vermont Superintendents Association, from business managers. The list truly does go on. And what feels really great about that is we've created standards that are representative of those critical levers that need to be pulled within a system to indicate success, but also are attainable for all districts across Vermont. So thinking about all school districts and the vast differences that we may experience in those different districts, these standards were created in a way that should be accessible to all. Lastly, the standards were created to focus on end results rather than prescriptive processes. So we're really thinking about not directing districts in such a prescriptive manner that it becomes unachievable or becomes somehow burdensome to them, but thinking about what does quality look like if a system has succeeded in this particular standard. And in describing that, we were able to create end results and allow districts to, implement methods that work best for them. Sorry, excuse me.
Next slide, please, Debbie. And thank you very much, Courtney, for all that information. We'll be coming back to you a little bit later in the presentation.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Before I introduce our next three speakers, I want to acknowledge the members of the task force who were involved in developing the governance standards. Although the AOE had ultimate responsibility for the governance standards, then Secretary of Education Dan French asked the VSBA to provide an initial draft for the agency's consideration. And the VSBA's approach was to involve school board members themselves. So we formed a task force with one school board member from each of our 11 regions to do this work. And I would like to thank the school board members listed on this slide who spent many hours working on the standards. Those board members with the asterisks also worked on drafting the proficiency scales for the standards. And now I would like to introduce Mark Clough from the Peachum School District Board, Edie Granning from the Mount Mansfield School District Board, and Mark Koenig from the Addison Northwest School District Board. Each of these school board members will cover one of the 3 sections of the governance standards, and those 3 sections are priorities, protocols, and processes. So we're going to start with Mark Clough covering governance priorities, and then we'll move on to Edie Granning covering governance protocols, and Mark Koenig covering governance processes. So go ahead, Mark Clough. And thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I wasn't listed in the task force, but I did spend many hours working on the final product. So I'm not just reading a script. I was a part of this process, and I was really pleased to be part of the process because this is something we're going to have to live and breathe. And it just means that we're good board members when we follow these standards that are being created. And so I'm starting with the governance priorities. Priorities are the SU or SD's goals that are identified as most important to the board. So it's going to take some inflection of each board to see what's important, maybe baby steps, maybe big steps. But an effective school board incorporates wide community input into its visions and goals involving the community. Regular sets and reviews measurably goals and make sure you're on track for what you've laid out for your plans and what you want your goals to be. Monitor student academic progress and wellness, and evaluates the superintendent's performance based on, in part, on the set goals that the board created. And the superintendent probably should be part of your goal setting. So very exciting.
Next
Thank
slide.
you, Sue.
Oh. Hi, Edie Granning from Mount Mansfield. Governance protocols is basically how the board agrees to structure itself to get the work of the board done. So again, there's flexibility here. The board is going to figure out what the norms of behavior and interactions are going to be for your board that promote transparency, predictability, and a group that works really well together. An effective school board will assess its own performance, review how it impacts the set goals, evaluate the community engagement and communication efforts, and provide the members of the board with ongoing training and support so that we can all do the job as best we can. All yours, Mark.
All right, so I have the third group, which is the processes. So Mark's priorities were sort of the 30,000-foot level for school boards to look at, the big pictures, your goals, your missions, your vision. And Edie's were protocols, you're sort of at the 10,000-foot level, how you get the work done as a cohesive board. And I'm bringing us to about the 1,000-foot level. We're not getting down on the ground because we leave that to our superintendents and the people that we don't want to micromanage. But the processes are actual things that you can do rather than grand visions. So you want to have the policies make sense. You want to review them on a timely basis, whether that means you're a policy governance board or you just work with policies. You want to make sure when you're building your budget that it follows the goals that you've set for yourself, that it makes sense, and you can explain to your taxpayers and your community why your budget aligns with what you say is important within your district. You want to, as a board, know what you've agreed to. So your master agreements with your staff and your teachers, or any major agreements you might have, like transportation, if you outsource your busing, things like that. You don't have to be able to quote them chapter and verse, but you should understand the basic premise of those. You should also understand, chapter 16 especially, but what Vermont laws govern public education. As we all probably lived and breathed the last session, keeping up on legislation is important. The various parts of Act 127 that's kind of went kablooey, it was important to follow up and keep in touch with what's happening as it affected our budgeting processes. And that leads into making sure you understand who your local officials are, who you can reach out to and talk to about what is happening either in your communities or within the state that is going to impact the work that your board does.
Thank you, Mark. We'll give it back to you, Courtney.
Thank you so much, folks, and apologies for my less than graceful exit from the first set of slides. Those of you who participated in this summer's webinar may remember I completely had laryngitis at that time. I assure you, I have adequate breathing conditions happening in my home. I also have a 4-year-old in childcare. So thank you all for your patience. All right, so something that I did want to share today and just get folks up to speed on is part 2 of the DQS rule. So when we talk about DQS in its entirety, we are speaking about the new rules, Rule Series 100, that covers those new domains, business, facilities, and governance. The second piece of that rule is the mechanism in which we will measure accountability and measure compliance with the new standards that have been set forth. We call this section the Quality Assurance Regulations, or QAR. So if folks start to see that acronym used in the context of DQS, this is what we're referring to. And this part of the rule determines the process by which district quality standard compliance, so again, specifically in those business operations, facilities management, and safety and governance, is evaluated prior to and in accordance with the existing statute. So it's important to note here that DQS did not create new provisions did not completely create new provisions in Title 16. However, it did create a bridge to those existing accountability mechanisms to say, this is a mechanism by which the state will hold districts accountable to certain measures of quality. This section of the rule also defines roles and responsibilities for the players in the DQS game. So we're defining responsibilities for school boards versus district administrators, the agency, and also the State Board of Education at that final leg of that accountability path. And something important to note here, the way that DQS was established, the rule itself was established, utilizes state assessment scores as the basis for that next level of intervention and review. In our next slide, I'll go over this in a little bit more detail, but ultimately what this means is that from the systems perspective, from those new domains, business operations, facilities management, and safety and governance, if a district is not showing less than satisfactory state assessment scores, there is not an intention to have a punitive or even a more intensive review cycle for those districts. Really kind of coming back into that idea of, why are we doing this? We're doing this to promote consistency and equity and access to high quality education. If the results are demonstrating that that is occurring, we are not going to provide a more scrutinous approach to or more intensive review to those districts. We will, however, have that very clear data to help support those districts and how they can better their systems, create more sustainable systems, and kind of keep that with a goal of keeping that satisfactory assessment score continuing and really improving as time goes on. And as I mentioned earlier, this process is designed to be achievable by Vermont's education system. So in the past, folks may remember integrated field reviews were a previous mechanism used to help measure district quality in some of these areas. That was very labor intensive. It required quite a bit of people power, not just from the agency, but more importantly from our districts. And so this process was designed with that in mind and to make sure that we do in fact have capacity from all parties involved to complete this work. Next slide, please. There are 3 major components to the quality assurance process around district quality standards. The first and perhaps simplest is the district self-evaluation. This will happen annually, and districts will be invited to complete a self-evaluation that is being built on a 1 to 4 proficiency scale, measuring their proficiency at each of these standards that have been developed in this rule. There are going to be excuse me, I'll back up. We are in the process right now of finalizing first drafts of these rubrics, so these 1 to 4 proficiency rubrics to accompany the self-eval. So this process will not be entirely subjective. We do want to provide some very clear examples of what proficiency looks like in each of these standards. That's not to say that there isn't opportunity for districts to rate themselves as proficient if their particular method is not available in the rubric or not created in the rubric. There is also a space for narrative response. And again, our goal in doing this is to ensure that level of consistency so that as all districts are completing these self-evaluations, there is a clear measure of quality that everyone is considering when rating, when completing their self-evaluations. The second part of the quality assurance process is that more intensive review. So this is named in the rule as the AOE 3-year intermediate review. This is a 3-year identification cycle. In the first year of the cycle, the AOE will review state assessment proficiency scores and annual self-evaluations. And as a reminder, those districts that move forward into this process will be those that show a less than proficient assessment score, not those based on poor proficiency in the self-evaluation. In years 1 and 2, so following the identification of those districts, the AOE would engage in a more intensive review with those districts. We will look closely at their self-evaluation scores. We will try to find where additional supports are needed and how improvements can be gained. And really, again, trying to look for those critical system levers that can be pulled to help show increases in state assessments and student outcomes. At the end of this 2-year cycle, the AOE may recommend corrective action and or technical assistance. So the difference there, I think, being the severity of corrective action needed, corrective action really being the more directive route versus technical assistance where we may say, things have gone okay. We suggest that this may help. This may make your system more effective or efficient moving forward. The last option, and this is really the handoff back to existing provisions of statute, is that following that 3-year intermediate review, if a district fails to make the corrective actions needed or required by the AOE based on the review process, the agency would make a recommendation to the State Board of Education for further steps. So ultimately, what this looks like is a hearing that would be conducted with the district and the State Board of Education. And the state board then has several options within statute that they can move forward with in terms of their level of corrective action. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pull us back. So that last slide kind of tends to put folks in the space of, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? This is a very punitive process. It is not. And so I want to take us back to what we really see as the future of this project. That self-evaluation, that annual self-evaluation is where we will find the most beneficial information, both as districts and as the agency. And in this first year of implementation, and I would even argue in the several years following implementation, these years are really about expectation setting. Very similarly to the way that we grade students, we cannot expect districts to achieve quality if we haven't defined for them what that looks like. So some of these standards may feel new. Certainly some of the criteria that will show up on the rubrics to assist in the self-evals may feel new as well. And it's really important that we all understand the expectation is not we're all getting A+ on the first year, right? The expectation is that we're clarifying what does quality look like and how can we take steps to achieve that. As a result, it's our expectation that many, if not most, districts will self-evaluate below proficient in many of these areas. So whether it's in business operations or governance or facility safety, we don't expect that the majority of districts will be at or above proficient when this rule is implemented next summer. I do think that's really, really important. If folks walk away with nothing else from today's presentation, please let it be this, that our focus here is setting the expectation and preparing for how the state can provide the technical assistance needed to achieve that level of proficiency. We will also, excuse me, I'll share a bit more about our approach, our planned approach for reviewing the self-evaluations. We do not expect to review each evaluation and deploy technical assistance on an individual district level. What we expect to do is take a look at trends and identify where technical assistance is needed most throughout the state. So that may be regional. It may be identifying a specific standard where most districts say we can't meet this and trying to understand why, but it will not be an individual specific evaluation based technical assistance. We are also going to leverage those districts that feel like they're really doing this well. So we also know that there are some districts that are above proficient, and even, moving forward away from proficiency, what does advanced efficiency or proficiency look like? And so we'll take our time, we'll take the time to understand, how did that come to be? What are the conditions within that district that allowed this to happen? And what lessons can be learned? Is it as simple as a system or tool that can be shared? Is it a group of, I'm hypothesizing here for a moment, right? Is it a set of written norms for a school board that are easy to follow and exist and can be shared amongst a larger group of folks? And so we will be deploying those technical supports from both ends of that proficiency scale, with the intended result of perhaps not a quick, but definitely a clear increase in proficiency over time. Again, as a reminder, DQS proficiency scores, so that self-eval alone will not trigger that intermediate review. This system will only work if we as the Vermonters who are responsible for these self-evals are honest about our level of proficiency. So we need to be very trusting and clear with ourselves and with our school communities that those self-eval results are not the trigger to that more intensive review. That is based on the assessment score data. And again, I'll say it, I think, for a third time, but it is important to reiterate, what we expect to see is improvement over time. This is certainly not an expectation that everybody achieves proficiency or above this year. It's not an expectation that everybody gets there in the second year. It is an expectation that we collectively are moving forward to a place of proficiency and really taking the time to understand what are those barriers that may be in the way of that. And then also, how can we take advantage of other tools or resources or information that may come out of districts who are doing this really well. Next slide, please. A glimpse into the work that's happening and upcoming. So as I mentioned, we are currently finalizing the rubrics that will go with the self-evaluations. If you can picture these, they are very similar to a grading rubric. They are a 1 through 4 proficiency scale rating. We are going through standard by standard and identifying what does proficiency look like in these standards, and how, what does it look like when one is approaching proficiency or in the advanced proficient state later on. There will also be space for a narrative review, or a narrative entry. So again, if your proficiency rating as a district or a board doesn't quite fit the boxes that have been established, there is opportunity to explain your rating, and also opportunity to explain why you may or may not be at proficiency. So if there were, again, creating the hypothetical here, perhaps 70% of your board turned over in 1 year, right? So like those situations that happen outside of our control that may be impacting your results, there is space to account for that. We do hope to have a larger stakeholder meeting later this fall. I think at this point, we're probably eyeing the November timeframe where we can collectively review these rubrics and get a final collective look at these and make sure they are something that resonates well to the folks who will end up using them ultimately. You'll note here that there is the second step is EQS integration into the self-eval template. DQS is not a measure against education quality standards. However, there are 8 references from EQS pulled into that intermediate review and self-eval process. So we are working to build the same format. We'll use the same formatting for a self-eval to account for those spaces. Really, in short, this means that in addition to business, facilities, and governance, there are also 8 sections of the new the newly edited education quality standards that will also be included in the self-eval process. We're working currently on defining that identification criteria. So again, how does a district become identified for that 3-year intermediate review? It's going to be based on assessment scores. We have a loose idea of how that will be implemented, and we'll share more about that in upcoming meetings. An important step that is really happening all along the way, but is identified here as step 4, is that we are also working to develop technical assistance where we can. So I'll provide the example in the business operations section. There is a standard related to timely data submissions for districts. And one of the realizations that we had collectively was that there is not a calendar from the Agency of Education that said, here are all of the data collections that one must pay attention to and the deadlines in which they apply. And so we've been working with our data team to make sure that that is available if we're going to be measuring proficiency against it. End goal here being that we can do some testing with different districts. I imagine that we'll be reaching out to the VSBA at some point to test the finished product before it goes live. And then we will implement that first round of self-evaluations in or shortly after July of 2025. I would say next slide, but I believe we are on to questions.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for all the information that you shared this evening. And I know school board members are a very thoughtful and curious group, so we'd like to give the school board members on the call the opportunity to ask our presenters any questions that you have about the governance standards. So if you have a question, please raise your Zoom hand and we'll recognize you. I'm not seeing any questions. I'm surprised. Oh, here we go. Kathy Larson. Go ahead, Kathy. Kathy,
Thank you.
you're muted. Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you. I just unmuted. Thank you. When you refer to district, are we talking about our local town boards or our supervisory union boards as a district?
It's an excellent question, Kathy, and I am prepared to answer, but I do think it will be easiest for me to just read from the definitions of the rule. It really does depend on which section of the rule we're talking about. So for example, the governance standards are incredibly specific to school district boards, and the definition here becomes anytime the word board is used, it is the board of an SUSD, and if applicable, the board of each member school district within an SU. So ultimately, we expect that with the self-eval process, it will be all boards within an SU that will be completing that. For some of the other standards, particularly those business operations standards that will be completed by a superintendent, it would be the superintendent at the SU level, if that's the highest level of hierarchy.
So I'm on my district board, Twin Valley, and I'm on my supervisory union board. So will we be doing 2 self-evaluations?
I believe that's the case, Kathy. It is also a question that I've signaled to Debbie and folks at the VSBA that we may want to just look into that a bit more before we really launch. But yes, I believe the intent is that all boards that operate within an SU or SD would participate in the self-eval.
Okay. So, okay, I'll stop asking questions.
Thanks, Kathy. That was a great question. Bill Edgerton, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I was part of the governance task force. I think everybody in the task force really believes in this initiative and think it could have very large positive consequences and results of this effort. And so I'm very excited about that. And I think everybody in the task force would be. We've got some challenges to fulfill every one of these things that we've identified, but I think we've got a commitment to move in a positive direction. My concern is, why isn't the state and why isn't AOE requiring the same level of effort with our independent schools? And the reason I mention that, among other things, is next year we're going to be in the midst of a huge new policy coming down from the state that's going to be affecting all our districts and supervisory districts. And we're going to be all over the place trying to meet those policy objectives as efficiently and effectively as possible. That challenge isn't being carried out by the independent schools. Why doesn't the state AOE have the same governance standards for our independent schools that we have to support through our tuition revenue?
Sure. Bill, I'm happy to respond. I'm not sure it will be a satisfactory one.
Oh, I know.
I'll
Fair
read
enough.
folks again how this rule came to be. So this was established by the legislature, who directed the AOE for the first time to engage in this level of rulemaking, and that direction was specific to public schools. I think it's a good point, Bill. I never say never, right? That's one of those things that we all have to get used to in the legislative process. But for the purposes of this implementation, that is why it's how the direction was established.
Good, thanks.
Thank you. We'll move to Martine Gulick.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. And thank you, Courtney. I guess my questions are a little more broad and even a little bit existential around all this work. I think it was probably a great idea, and I think it's full of wonderful possibilities for our school districts. I'm worried that in the intervening years between when this legislation was passed and what's happening currently, the landscape has changed. We're struggling to pass school budgets, and I'm imagining that we'll be seeing cuts in our business offices, our administrative offices, et cetera. And I'm wondering who is going to be responsible for the work of gathering the data and, writing up these evaluations, et cetera, for all of you. And on the other side of that is who at the AOE is going to be doing this work, because my sense is that the AOE has also struggled to fulfill some of its really important work over the years, probably because it's understaffed. But I'm wondering have you hired anyone new to help? You mentioned that there's going to be a lot of technical assistance. I'm wondering if you've hired someone to do that work.
Yeah, Martine, I will respond, and then I'm going to also turn it over to Jill for a moment here. So you mentioned a couple of things that I do think are important to touch on. In thinking about the development of the standards and the way that the landscape has changed in the last couple of years, we were from the start developing these standards around something, or to be something scalable, to be something that could be moved forward into whatever the future state of education looks like, even at that time, even before we really understood the degree of which these conversations were going to be happening 2 years later. But I invite folks to take some time, if you haven't recently, to review the standards. They are not so hyper specific that they can't exist in a different environment. They are things, again, really focused on those critical high leverage components of these systems of the business operations world. For example, thinking about how do you ensure that a budget is connected to district goals and not created completely in separate ways. It's a theme within most of the standards. I will also say that we, again, worked very closely, and even we're doing it now, we're doing even a further refinement now with the people who do this work to ensure that, to ensure a few things. One is the measure of proficiency that we're describing reasonably descriptive of proficiency, and really thinking about not is it reasonable for us to achieve it, but is that a reasonable description of quality, right? So if we can't reach that bar, that's okay. How do we identify how to get there? And then also making sure that in building the rubrics that will accompany the self-evals, that we are offering those clear descriptions to try to make the actual process of completing the evaluation far less burdensome. On the AOE side, we do have a plan for how this will be implemented. We have teams already used to doing this kind of work. We are actively and strategically trying to integrate this work into other accountability mechanisms. So thinking about, without getting too far into the weeds, thinking about how do we already use those assessment scores to deploy other resources? How can we integrate those two or three or four, right? Sometimes accountability methods together, and ensuring ultimately that we're not doing the same work twice for the same result. I will pause there and turn to Jill.
Court, great answers. And Martine, I think you're asking a really important question. I would argue that these standards have never been more important given our crisis, because what they're descriptors of is core mission work, the core work of districts, right? And the core work of boards. And I think that what it provides us all collectively with is a shared understanding, a shared set of language, and also work that we can focus on as, again, that core work. It's that description. What is it that school boards do? What is it that districts do? What is it that supervisory unions do? Is captured in these standards. There's nothing that's new work here. Is I think really important, because we're all really cognizant. I think we all live every day the outcomes of unfunded mandates, initiatives that are not aligned to maybe what our kind of shared priorities can or should be. So I think that's really important. To me, this provides us with a shared lodestone of quality. And as a former educator, I don't think of myself as a former educator, but I currently am a former educator. And Martine, I know you are as well, one of the critical things is that you cannot measure students against a standard that they don't understand, right? And so as we all collectively are having challenging conversations and a challenging look at our current system and what it may appear to be in the future, being able to point to and focus on that core work and what it looks like when it's done well is, I think, for me, helpful in giving us all a focus and a lodestone. And to your question about the agency, this gets back to what Zoe has been talking about, which is how one of our key focuses right now is aligning the agency's resources and our structure and our personnel to what our strategic priorities are. So first, understanding what those goals and priorities are is the work that's underway. And then you make the moves to adjust to that. And one of those is very much driven by this work. So I wouldn't make the assumption that we don't have a plan for this or that we're not prepared to do this work, because this is, I would say, core mission work for the agency right now. So feeling positive about this in ways that I wouldn't necessarily if you asked me a different question, Martine.
Thank you, Jill. We have 4 more questions. We're almost at 7 o'clock, but I think we can go a little bit over if people are committed to being relatively brief. So I know Don Collins has his hand up, and after Don, I'll call on Christopher, Herb Ogden, and then Michael Inners. So go ahead, Don Collins.
All right, thank you very much. I want to thank my colleagues who worked on this and all of you people who have done a great job. I've been around too long and to find out that great ideas and a lot of hard work many times has not gone to its potential because of the understaffing in the agency, used to be Department of Education. So my question is, do we have a commitment from the legislature and the governor to fund this process to the level that you good people who are leading it won't leave? I could spend the next half hour telling you about very good people who had very good ideas, but they got frustrated because they never had the staffing or they lost staffing to bring it through. I may not be on the school board 5 years from now or 3 years from now, but I would hope all of you, Courtney, Jill, and all the other people, my former colleagues in school on the VSBA, are still working on it. It's great. It sounds good, and I believe it'll make a difference. But unless and whoever the governor may be in the next 3 to 5 years, and the legislators clearly understand that you have to recruit and keep and pay good people if you want to fulfill the goals. And I've yet to see that, so I'm an optimist and say maybe this is the time it'll happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. We
Yeah.
will. I think we
here.
might have lost Christopher had a question. So we'll move to Herb Ogden.
And I just wanted to follow up on what Donald and Martina said. I don't think a number of boards will take these standards very seriously until the Agency of Education has enough staff to do what 131.2, 131.3 call for. For example, is there anything in the current organizational chart that shows who's going to be in charge of handling those things? I think you have a great idea here, but based on things like the agency's inability to even come up with an accurate snapshot of our own district's performance, I am very skeptical that you have the staff to do it with.
Herb, thank you. At this point, all I can say is echo what Jill has already answered. We have a fairly robust approach for how we will be doing this. I don't believe that it's one person from the agency that will have a dedicated DQS manager role necessarily, but it's shared work that is so intimately integrated with a lot of the existing work that we do and can easily be shared across multiple divisions. And so I think, this is something that we have been considering for several years now as DQS has moved forward. We've been thinking about these hard questions. How will we staff this? How will we ensure capacity in the long term? That's the best I can do at this point, is to say that we have a plan. We've thought it through with a pretty significant level of detail around it. And the best we can do is implement and adjust accordingly.
Herb, I can offer you some concrete examples because this question has now come up several times. So let me give you some concretes. So as you dig into the standards and you notice that there are standards around school facilities having to do with capital planning, the maintenance manual, and some other standards. Those may be familiar because they come from Act 72. So there are staff within the agency whose job it is to develop those tools, to provide technical assistance to the field. The tools are built and are being built in partnership with the field. And in addition to that, we've also now completed a facilities assessment that includes a database that our field partners, our business managers and facilities directors are able to access directly, update information, and then generate the reports required by the district quality standards. So in talking about resource and capacity, that's the really intentional work that we're doing right now. So there's a very specific example for you. If you look at the safety standards, that does have a dedicated team within the agency, and then also our partners at the Vermont School Safety Center, whose work is dedicated to this. So I actually fully understand the skepticism. I like to remind folks that I started March 16th of 2020 and never did the job I was hired to do, right? So I was in COVID. I became a COVID federal emergency funds manager. I've worked in operations now, emergency operations. It's always something new and exciting to do. But what I'm sort of cautioning folks here, with an understanding of your historical perspective and not in any way taking away from that, is that this has been the result of a really deliberative process, and that all along the way we've been pointing to resource gaps that exist. We've been pointing to the tools and technical assistance that needs to be present by the time we're at the implementation stage. But I would also really echo what Courtney said, is that every one of these standards really has folks within the agency who have some subject matter expertise. I will also signal that one of the places where we need to further build our capacity to support, and we're doing this in partnership with VSBA, is what are the resources that school boards might need, because that's not a space I think we can all recognize that the agency has ever engaged in, sort of by statute, right? Sort of by design. But we've been working closely with VSBA around the standard building for 2 years now. So I'm in no way saying that I don't understand sort of your historical perspective, but I'm asking for a suspension of disbelief for a moment, and I'm trying to give you some specific examples of the way that we're doing this really concretely and really planfully.
Thank you, Jill. Michael Inners, do you still have a question?
No, I'll pass.
Okay. Thank you. I don't see any other hands, and that's good because we are over time. And at this point, we're going to close by thanking all of you for attending your regional meeting this evening. As a membership association, the VSBA really appreciates your service as local school board members and your engagement with your association. And of course, you are the reason that we exist, and we are here to serve you. The VSBA is always trying to improve in everything we do. So if you have feedback for us about tonight's meeting, please share that by way of an email to us. And we look forward to seeing each of you at the annual conference on October 24th and 25th. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much for being.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Thanks.